When your father dies, you think the worst is already over. That grief is the bottom, that you just have to keep living somehow. I was wrong. The bottom was much deeper than that. And my brother was standing there, with already signed documents in his hand. My name is Alex. I'm 39. I'm a surgeon. I work at a hospital in Atlanta. 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer. That's important to understand from the start, because that's exactly what Max was counting on. That I'm always busy, always far away, always trusting. There are two of us. Max is the older one, 46. He spent his whole life 10 minutes from our parents' house in Augusta. No steady job, but always nearby, always ready to help, always the first to answer when Mum called. I understand now what that actually was. IT was an investment. My dad, Robert, 68 years old, a former construction foreman who built 3 houses in the county with his own hands. A man whose word meant more than any contract. In January, he called me himself. That was rare. Usually, I was the one who called. He spoke calmly. The diagnosis was pancreatic cancer, stage 3. He'd known for weeks. Didn't want to say anything before he was sure. I drove down the next day. Spent 3 weeks with him. We talked for real, maybe for the first time in years. One evening he told me something important. Said he'd already taken care of everything. That Max and I would each get half. That's how it should be. I told him we didn't need to talk about that. He insisted. Said he wanted me to know. I remembered, and then I left because Max called and said I should go back to Atlanta. That I had patience. That he was there. That Dad was in good hands. Asked if I trusted him. I did. We were brothers. In February, Dad got worse. Max took over everything. Doctors, medication, care, paperwork. He set up a medical power of attorney so I wouldn't have to drive down for every piece of bureaucracy. Reasonable. I agreed. I called Dad every 2 or 3 days. He'd answer briefly, tired, hard to talk. Max would explain, strong painkillers. Normal for this stage. In March I called and Dad didn't pick up. Max answered instead. Said Dad was sleeping, that he'd pass along my hello. I asked if maybe I should come down. Max said it wasn't necessary, that Dad was stable, that I'd come for Easter and Dad would be happy to see me. By Easter, Dad was barely conscious for most of the day. In May, he was gone. Max organized everything perfectly. The casket, the flowers, the burial plot, the reception at the family home. People came up to him, shook his hand, said he was a real son. Said he'd done so much for his father. I stood beside him. The one who rarely visited. The one who always had work. Max accepted condolences with a look on his face that almost made me believe it myself. Almost. Because 2 days before Dad died, when I was already in Augusta, sitting at his bedside, Dad opened his eyes, looked at me, and said quietly, with great effort, that I needed to forgive him. That he hadn't understood what he was signing. I told myself it was the morphine. The confusion of a dying man. I took his hand and said everything was okay, that I was there. He closed his eyes. I didn't know then that it wasn't confusion. It was a confession. 2 weeks after the funeral, the notary, Mum, me, and Max around a table. I knew the old will by heart. Dad had told me himself. The house to Mum, savings and land split equally, the car split equally, everything fair. The notary opened the folder, a new will, drawn up in March. The house to Max, the land to Max, the savings after, deducting care expenses that Max had documented at $41,000, the remainder also to Max. Mum, got lifelong residency in the house, no right to sell or transfer. My name didn't appear once. Mum was staring at the table. She already knew. Max had told her the day before, explained that Dad had decided this himself, that Alex earns well and doesn't need anything. That it was his wish. I looked at Mum, then at Max. Max held my gaze. He was good at that. I quietly asked the notary for a certified copy. I sat in my car outside Mum's house and didn't think about money. I thought about what Dad had said. March, heavy painkillers. Max there constantly. A notary from another district, not the family one. A power of attorney filed back in February. I'm a surgeon. I know what high-dose opioids combined with sedatives do to a person. Someone in that state can sign a document, can nod, can say yes, Whether they understand what they're agreeing to, that's an entirely different question. Dad didn't change his mind. Dad didn't know what he was signing. I got out of the car, went inside, sat across from Mum at the kitchen table and asked her to tell me everything she remembered from March. She started to cry, and then she talked. She spoke quietly. Sometimes she'd stop, look into her cup. In March, Max had essentially moved in. He slept in the guest room, controlled everything. The medication, the doctor visits, the phone calls. One day she walked into Dad's room and saw a stranger with a folder. Max was standing beside the bed, speaking quietly to Dad. She asked what was happening. Max told her it was just insurance paperwork. Said not to worry. Said to go rest. She left. She trusted her older son. The next day Dad asked her what he had signed. She didn't know. He said he couldn't remember. That Max told him they were important papers. That his hand wasn't cooperating, but he signed. Mum didn't think much of it. She thought insurance. She thought Max will handle it. When she finished, I didn't say anything. I stood up, I hugged her, and drove home. I worked for 3 weeks, alongside my shifts, through the nights, not for the money. Dad told me the truth with the last words he had left, and I wasn't going to pretend I hadn't heard him. I found the notary who drew up the new will, went in person, asked who was present during the signing. The answer was the client and a companion. The companion was Max. I asked whether the notary personally verified the client's capacity to understand. A pause, then a formal answer. Everything was conducted according to procedure. I thanked him and left. I requested Dad's medical records for March. As his son, I had the right. The medication chart showed high-dose oxycodone combined with lorazepam, a sedative. A combination where a person can appear coherent, answer simple questions, but critical thinking is essentially gone. I didn't read that online. I'm a surgeon. I've seen that state hundreds of times. I found the home nurse, a woman named Deborah, who had cared for Dad in March. I called her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said Dad had asked her several times to call me. That he'd say, "Please call Alex, I want to talk to him." She'd pass it along to Max each time. Max would say he'd reach out himself. She thought that was just how it worked. Now she regretted it. I asked her to give written testimony. She agreed, and then the ugliest part. $41,000 in documented care expenses that Max deducted before the estate was divided. I requested Dad's bank statements. As a son, still legal. Of that $41,000, $23,800 had nothing to do with medical care. Transfers to an account that turned out to be Max's personal one. Dated February and March. Dad was still alive. Dad was sedated, and his money was already leaving. Max called me himself. 10 days after I retained an attorney, his voice was warm, almost wounded. He said, "Why was I doing this? That this was family. That Dad had decided this himself." I told him Dad had said 2 days before he died that he hadn't understood what he was signing, and that Max had been in the hallway. He'd heard it. Max said Dad was on morphine, that he wasn't thinking clearly anymore. I told him that was exactly the point, that I was a doctor and I understood precisely what that meant legally. He told me I was destroying the family over money. I told him no, I was restoring what he had destroyed. Those were 2 different things. That same evening, he called Mum. He was crying, said I was trying to ruin him, that Dad loved him more, that he'd given his best years to caring for their parents. Mum called me afterward, asked quietly, did he really do this? I said yes, he really did. A long pause. Then she said, do what you have to do. The case ran for 5 months. A forensic medical evaluation confirmed that at the time of signing, Robert was under the influence of substances critically affecting his capacity for informed decision-making. Deborah's testimony, the medical records, the bank statements, a neighbor who saw an unfamiliar man with a folder arrive with Max and leave 40 minutes later. The March will was declared invalid. The previous one, written 2 years earlier, took effect. Everything split equally, the way Dad wanted. The way he'd promised me. A criminal investigation was opened for the unauthorized transfers. Negotiations for a plea agreement are ongoing. Max doesn't call. Neither do I. Mum lives in her house. Her house now. For real. Some evenings she sits on the porch and looks at the yard Dad spent 30 years tending. I come once a month. We drink coffee. We talk about him. He was a good man. He trusted the wrong son, but his last words he gave to the right one. I heard you, Dad. I took care of it. Tell me honestly, would you have taken your own brother to court? Or let it go for the sake of the family? Leave a comment. I read everyone.